For some groups of women, and particularly those from ethnic minority backgrounds, that this legislation makes them feel scared and worried. I think we are hearing a lot of the time that this is liberating legislation, and in a sense, the narrative is that this is meant to give you a sense of control, choice, and to feel less fearful. In the reality of the testimonies that we heard today, that isn't what everyone is feeling about this legislation.
Welcome to Assisted. I'm Chelsea Roff. Assisted dying is said to be a compassionate, caring choice.
In this series, we explore why it's not that simple. I'm Fiona Mackenzie, and we'll look at why assisted dying has such a big impact on women. I'm actually incredibly excited that tonight Chelsea and I are joined by Jess Asato, who is the new MP for Lowestoft, who is just an incredible powerhouse of a campaigner for women, has done lots of work before she joined Parliament. Since joining, she has also been one of the clearest voices speaking out in order to protect women in the bill on assisted dying, which is proceeding through Westminster at the moment. So just so glad you could join us, Jess. Thank you.
Me too.
And I just wanted to sort of kick off. You're a new MP. There's lots that you want to get into in your time in Parliament. But what's made you really think I have to sort of step in and talk about women more in this bill that we're talking about in Westminster?
Well, I'll be honest with you, Fiona, that it wasn't something that sort of dominated my thinking before I came into Parliament. Of course, when you stand for Parliament, these big conscience issues are things that you have to think about, and it's important that you do. But until you're presented, with a conscience vote, which this is, you don't necessarily go through all of the thought processes and all of the details. So it was only once I'd been elected that I knew that this was probably going to happen. I started really speaking to people about, what they thought should happen. I guess instinctively, I pro-choice in this place. I would probably want this for myself if I could create just a bill for me. But because of my background working in the domestic abuse sector for 6 years, an amazing charity called Safe Lives, and then the last 3 years for Barnardo's children's charity, I've obviously worked in and around issues of safeguarding, vulnerability, and I guess I've seen really quite a lot of the dark things, sadly, that humans can do to each other. And it got me thinking really about the vulnerability of people, particularly at the end of life, and reflecting on a time when I was working to try and understand the impact of domestic abuse on older people and older women in particular. And I remembered a story that I had heard from an independent domestic violence advisor working in a hospital setting, something that we were really championing at the time to make sure those specialists were in hospitals and supporting GPs. And she said to me that she had been called to the bedside of a lady in her. Sadly, she was dying of cancer, so she was at the end of her life. And it was relatively unusual for the IDVA to be called to somebody who was terminally ill. But when she sat with the lady said, I really, really just needed to disclose that I have been in a domestic abuse situation for almost all of my life, and I just needed to be able to disclose that to somebody so that I could finally be free. And remembering that story, that experience, made me think, well, hold on a minute, are we completely sure that the move towards assisted dying isn't going to end up actually making life harder for vulnerable people, victims of domestic abuse, older people who may be experiencing family abuse, who may be prone to financial abuse and so forth, but also let's think about disabled people. And all of that started me thinking about, we should be making sure that this bill works for the most vulnerable in society. And so once I started sort of talking to, different sort of palliative care specialists and other women in the women's sector, I started to get more and more worried, which is why I have, put down an amendment to the bill on coercive controlling behaviour training, which was accepted, as you know, by the bill sponsor this week. I've always said that I want to be constructive about this bill, even though I have some really, really deep misgivings. I think as a legislator, your job is to work to convince people of your argument, but also to make good law. And so from my perspective, if the will of Parliament is that this bill goes through, then it needs to be in the best place to protect vulnerable women and vulnerable people.
You have been just, I have to say, a brilliant leader on this. You've been so clear on it. Fiona and I both had the honour, really, of joining you in Westminster today, and you gathered people from all across the women's sector to have a conversation about this. And I have not done a recent tally, but I'm pretty sure your amendment got almost the most number of MPs supporting it. So you've done so much on this. I wonder if you could speak a little bit to, there's so many MPs in Parliament that are really generally in favour of legislation to protect women. And yet this can be a very divisive issue. For those that maybe kind of default to being in favour of the bill, what are some of the things that you heard today from organisations that maybe they're not hearing, and some of the conversation that you maybe think is missing from the discourse right now in Parliament?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And it was such an interesting conversation today, bringing together women from lots of different walks of life and sectors. I think the thing that I felt I hadn't quite heard before was that for some groups of women, particularly those from ethnic minority backgrounds, that this legislation makes them feel scared and worried. I think we are hearing a lot of the time that this is liberating legislation, and in a sense, the narrative is that this is meant to give you a sense of control, choice, and to feel less fearful, I guess, about the end of life. And I think that's how a lot of people feel, which is that, oh, thank goodness, I don't have to worry. I don't have to worry about what happens to me at the end of life, because there's going to be a plan. And if it's really bad, I've got this choice. But actually, in the reality of the testimonies that we heard today, that isn't what everyone is feeling about this legislation. And so that really sort of sunk into me. The other thing that I heard loud and clear is something that I've sort of pondered about, I've thought about, I've worried about, but I've never heard it actually articulated, which is that we heard a number of women had been interviewed who were at the end of life, so receiving that palliative care, and then asked about this bill and the sort of situations they've been in terms of domestic abuse situations. And they said, almost all of them, we were told, they would use this bill to take their life because the situation they find themselves in is just so horrific. But not from the terminal illness perspective, but from the domestic abuse around them. And that it's the two combined that actually in the end would actually spur them on to just using this as a way of stopping it, ending it. And also that the abusive partners or husbands who might be abusing them, that actually by becoming terminally ill, those women were no longer useful, or they weren't fulfilling the traditional roles that perpetrator wanted them to, so making their meals, tidying up the home. And that in some cases the perpetrator wouldn't care for their dying wife because they would see it as a failing, and that they would be forcing them to get up and do the cleaning even as they were suffering. And so the combination of that abuse continuing and the terminal illness and the pain, an option of assisted dying in that situation for some women would actually be a release, not just from the terminal illness, but actually from the abuse that they're experiencing. And I think I hadn't heard that as clearly as I did today.
These stories are they're so alarming, and I think we have to wrestle with them. And it was so heartening to be in a room full of women who were starting to wrestle with this, because I don't know if you sense this, but in committee there's been a real kind of rush to get through the bill and to finish, to push ahead, and there hasn't been enough, I think, stopping and thinking, actually, if we do this, if we win, and it looks like they may win, this may become law, how do we make sure that we don't have a public inquiry in 2 years' time once this becomes law? Almost immediately we start to see the abuses we see in other countries. And I was really struck hearing from disabled women about the way that it makes them feel, and also their insights into how medical professionals can almost default to assuming that you're not worth treating. The mother of a person with learning disabilities who just expressed her fears around what this law might do, and the fact that the committee has just shrugged off opportunities to make additional safeguards for people with learning disabilities. These are really difficult issues to wrestle with, but I think it was so important for us to start getting together, and I believe you're going to organise future discussions in Parliament. Can we say that? So I think it will be an event for MPs that people can ask their MP to attend.
I'm hoping to organise sort of a similar session for MPs who may still not have made their mind up, or even those who have, to come and listen to the perspectives of women. I hope both of you might come along to speak, because I agree. I just don't think there have been enough of these spaces for us to kind of really mull through what are the consequences of this, and they're a myriad, aren't they? And that's the thing. And we can't have all the answers. The committee don't have all of the answers.
One of the amendments that you've been successful in adding to this bill was really widely supported, which is for doctors doing the assessment for assisted dying to get training in domestic abuse and coercive control and financial abuse. So that's a big step forward in trying to protect women. As we've said previously, we think that perhaps 1,400 a year will die in assisted suicide who are domestic abuse victims, and that's obviously something that is very difficult to reduce that number, but if training can go some way to doing that, that would be wonderful. What's your sense, Jess? Is that amendment enough to make this bill safe, or the safest bill in the world?
No, it isn't, because many women don't know that they are victims of coercive controlling behaviour, or victims of domestic abuse, or a victim of anything. If they're still in the relationship and it's still happening to them, often it becomes something that they just live with and they expect, and in some cases they believe that they deserve, because that's how they have been coercively controlled. It isn't possible to be trained and then spot every single victim of abuse. It's just not possible. However, with the right kind of training, you can ask the right questions to start to build up a picture of that person and what might be happening to them and around them. That training does need to be delivered by specialist professionals from the domestic abuse sector. It cannot be e-learning or, tick box, answer these questions after, an hour's lecture sort of thing. And it has to be in depth, it has to be over a period of time, and it needs to be done regularly. So one of the things I think we heard today was that actually, in order to understand whether your learning is making a difference, you need to practice and then you need to review. And that's what we would all do in our jobs, wouldn't it? That's how you do learn. You have training and you don't just put it on a shelf. You then look at whether you're actually using it and it's working. So at the moment, they're obviously very, very pleased that Kim and the rest of the committee agreed to put this through. But the devil will be in the detail. And I know lots of people say that, and it's become pretty banal to say that sort of thing. But actually, if it ends up being, like I think you've written about the Australian model, which is just an hour long, if it's that, it's probably not worth the paper. It's not worth the effort, because actually the detail of the training will be in the regulations, and it's very, very hard as an MP to influence those, because that will sit with the government if and when the bill goes through. So, I'm always hopeful though. I'm a positive person. I believe that any change, no matter how small, is important in this space, not least because, there may be doctors and, other professionals who may get training where they may not have had it, and in the rest of their job, they will be meeting victims of domestic abuse. So for me, it will not make the bill completely safe. We hope might be able to enable those medical professionals to spot some victims of domestic abuse where they might otherwise not have done, and therefore then of course they wouldn't be eligible necessarily for the assisted suicide itself. But I worry about how it will be rolled out. So, we're going to keep going. But also, of course, it only was relevant to the medical professionals involved in the process, not the new panel, because my amendment was tabled before the panel sort of came forward. So I've actually tabled a new amendment on the same sort of theme, but that is about the new panel.
Yeah. I mean, it's I will say just kudos on getting an amendment through, because we have seen countless amendments not get through at all. And it is one that, as you say, will at least help to mitigate the harm. It may not eliminate the harm, but it would do some good should the law be passed. I just have one final question for you. There's some of us and some MPs that are very attentive to what's happening on the committee now, and there are others who, understandably, anyone has kind of tuned out and gone, I will come back to this when we're closer to third reading. It's a little bit too much day to day. For those who maybe haven't been paying that close attention and maybe feel like, okay, the safeguards are out, now we have training for to detect coercive control. We're all good. We've got a better bill. What's the one thing maybe you would want them to know, or the one question maybe they should be asking themselves as we approach approach third reading?
That's a great question. I can't think of one. That's the problem, because I think that there are too many holes still remaining. And to take your field of work, Chelsea, I genuinely do think that the fact that eating disorders hasn't been given that opt-out, I am extremely worried about that. And if you're thinking about this from a gendered perspective, we know that is going to affect more women and young women who may have been failed by the state, who then opt to take this measure. I know that, of course, there have been a lot of arguments to say, oh, no, because it's reversible, they won't be eligible. But that isn't what's happening in the here and now. They've been given a terminal diagnosis. That is what I think will prevail. For example, if this bill goes through and say somebody were to take this to court, I think the terminal judgment would be the one that the judge would look at, not whether it was reversible, because they would look at whether the doctors say it's reversible, and if they say no, it's not, that's it, right? So I guess that's one area I'd really recommend any MPs who haven't, and I understand that, like, we're all incredibly busy, right? That is, that's the job. We've got our constituency. There's lots of other legislation going through. Really, I'd like them to look at that and really think about, is that really what we really want? The other bit of this, I think, is about that's coming up, is to do with both the way in which you sign, to do this, and the fact you can use a proxy, and the fact that it can be somebody you don't know and somebody who's of some standing in the local community. That is very old-fashioned and very open, I would say, to abuse. And the other aspect of that is to do with the lack of medical liability for any of the medical professionals administering the cocktail of drugs. That seems to me to be really odd, just really odd. Look, no system is perfect. Like, we've got to accept that. We do across the rest of our life, don't we? And all of the other laws that we maybe recognise, there's got to be a remedy if something goes wrong. So in this system, why? Why wouldn't we have a remedy if something goes wrong? That really worries me, because we know there have been circumstances where this has been brought in other jurisdictions where things have gone wrong. Because human bodies are not all completely the same. We're all unique, right? And we all react in slightly different ways to things that are given to us. So, those would be the things I would ask MPs just really start to pay a bit more attention to, look into some of those arguments, really think it through and think, hold on a minute, am I applying the same standards I would to any other legislation, to this legislation as well? Is it safe? Will it work? Where's the remedy? What's the impact on the most vulnerable? What are the unintended consequences? Those are always the sorts of questions we should be asking of any piece of legislation. But this one is the most important, I think, and I've said before, most important probably in my lifetime, and certainly in my time as a parliamentarian, when it comes to the huge shift that we are about to make in terms of the way we think about our society, ourselves, our family and death.
Yeah, well, and what we heard today, and I know you've spoken so well too, is that there's so much work to be done on the NHS, on palliative care, on mental health services. And this is one bill. It doesn't have to be the be-all, end-all bill. It's a private member's bill. There's been quite a lot of progress made, a lot of conversation. There hasn't been the impact assessment and all of these, so it still could at this point be pulled, and the government could go back and go, we've learned something from this, and return to this another time. So it doesn't mean no, never, but there still is time to revert. And MPs could come to at third reading and go, still for this in principle, not confident in the safeguards, not confident that we have enough information to ensure that it passes the public safety test.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, there are a number of options, aren't there? There have been a couple of calls for a Royal Commission. I just really felt that, because we held that meeting today with members of the women's sector, if this had been a proper bill process, a lot more of those meetings would have happened. We would have explored some more of these issues. And I think because that hasn't happened, it just feels like a completely incomplete process where we're still trying to grapple with what the eventualities of this is. And that is not a great place to be, frankly, as a legislator, but it certainly isn't good from a sort of public policy making perspective. That this is just not how we're meant to make law or policy in this country.
Hi, it's Fiona. Chelsea and I were so keen that we start to hear some really detailed debate on what assisted dying could look like here in the UK for women. We do not have big money funding, so if you'd like to support us, you can go over to our Substack and subscribe there, or you can donate to The Other Half on our website, theotherhalf.uk/donate. patreon.com/donate. So grateful for this and so grateful for you listening though.